Elderly man asks Hell's Angels for help. My caregiver says I must stay quiet. The old man stood shaking beside the roaring engines, his voice barely stronger than the wind. They say I must stay quiet, he whispered. He didn't know these men, but he knew silence was killing him faster than fear ever could. At exactly 3:12 p.m., the noise took over the parking lot. Engines growled like thunder trapped in metal. Chrome flashed under the sun. Leather vests moved like shadows across the cracked asphalt. People inside the diner stopped chewing, stopped talking, stopped breathing for a moment. Hell's Angels had arrived, not loud on purpose, just heavy with presence, the kind of weight that made the world pause. That's when Harold Whitman stepped outside, 79 years old, thin frame, a brown cardigan buttoned wrong, one sleeve pulled lower than the other, hiding something. His back curved forward like life had pressed down on it for too long. He stood near the door, hands trembling, eyes scanning the men like he was deciding whether to step off a cliff. For 6 months, his caregiver told him the same thing. Stay quiet, you'll only make things worse. No one will believe you. Harold believed her, until today. One of the bikers noticed him first, a man called Cross, late 50s, scar over one eye. He nudged the man next to him, a big guy with silver hair and a calm face known as Mason. Old-timer looks lost, Cross said. Harold took one step forward, then another. Each step felt like betrayal. His heart hammered so hard he could hear it in his ears. He reached the group and stopped just short of them, like there was an invisible line he wasn't allowed to cross. I'm sorry, Harold said, his voice cracked in the middle. I know you're busy. The laughter died instantly. Mason turned fully toward him, removing his sunglasses slowly. His eyes weren't angry, they were alert. Careful, you okay, sir? Mason asked. Harold swallowed. His mouth felt dry. He pulled his sleeve back. Purple bruises bloomed along his wrist, finger-shaped, fresh. My caregiver says, Harold whispered, barely louder than the engines cooling behind them, that I must stay quiet. The parking lot felt suddenly very small and very still. Harold Whitman wasn't always this man. There was a time he filled rooms with quiet confidence. Not loud, not flashy, just steady. He spent 42 years as a public school janitor in Ohio. Knew every hallway by heart, fixed broken lockers with borrowed tools, showed up early, left late, never complained. Kids trusted him more than teachers sometimes. His wife, Alina, used to say Harold had safe hands. She meant it literally. He held babies gently, carried groceries like they were fragile glass. When Alina got sick, it was Harold who learned how to bathe her without hurting her pride, how to feed her without making her feel weak. They were married 55 years. When Alina died, the house went quiet in a way Harold had never known. Not peaceful quiet, hollow quiet, the kind that echoes even when you're breathing. Their son lived 2 states away. Busy life, good intentions, short phone calls. We'll figure something out, Dad. That's how Melissa Grant entered his life. Licensed caregiver, clean uniform, warm smile, perfect paperwork. She spoke slowly, kindly, touched his shoulder when she talked, looked him in the eye. At first she helped, cooked, cleaned, organized pills in neat little boxes. She told him he didn't have to worry anymore, that she'd take care of things, and Harold wanted to believe her. When she suggested handling his finances, he hesitated. She smiled wider. People your age get targeted, she said softly. I just want to protect you. Protection slowly became control. Phone calls stopped. Mail disappeared. His debit card vanished for safekeeping. When he asked questions, her voice hardened. When he pushed back, her hand tightened around his wrist. The first bruise came with an apology. The second came with a warning. By the time the bruises stayed, Harold had learned the rule. Stay quiet. People feared the Hell's Angels for how they looked. Leather, tattoos, heavy boots. Faces shaped by hard miles and harder choices. Stories written across skin in ink and scars. Mothers pulled kids closer when they passed. Store owners watched carefully, but fear rarely tells the whole story. Mason had buried a daughter. Cross had raised his sister's kids after prison took their father. Another man, Eli, volunteered every winter at a shelter but never told anyone. They didn't talk about that part. They listened. When Harold finished speaking, no one rushed him. No one interrupted. Mason crouched so they were eye level. He didn't touch Harold, just stayed close enough that Harold could feel warmth. "Who hurts you?" Mason asked. Harold's lips trembled. Saying her name felt like inviting punishment, but something had already shifted. The silence rule had cracked. "My caregiver," he said. "Melissa." Eli's jaw tightened. Cross looked away for a second, jaw working. Someone exhaled slowly through their nose. "Does she live with you?" Mason asked. "Yes." "Does she control your money?" Harold nodded. "Does she know you're here?" Harold shook his head fast. Fear flooded back in. "If she finds out." "She won't," Mason said calmly. "Not a promise. A decision." He stood and turned to the others. No dramatic speeches, no anger, just quiet understanding. "Call Linda," Mason said. "Adult Protective Services." "And my niece." Cross nodded, already moving. Mason looked back at Harold. "You broke the rule today," he said gently. "That took courage." Harold's eyes filled with tears. He hadn't allowed himself to shed in months. "I didn't know who else to ask," he whispered. Mason placed his jacket around Harold's shoulders. "Sometimes," he said, "help doesn't look how you expect." Melissa Grant noticed something was wrong the moment Harold didn't answer his phone. By the time the black bikes lined the street outside the small white house, she was already packing a bag. Inside, Harold sat on his own couch for the first time in months without being watched. The house smelled like dust and old memories. The walls felt closer than he remembered. An APS worker spoke softly. A police officer stood nearby. Mason waited outside, leaning against his bike, arms crossed, eyes steady. When Melissa tried to leave through the back door, she found it blocked. Not by violence, by presence. Statements were taken, accounts frozen, evidence collected, bruises photographed. The truth unfolded slowly, painfully, but fully. Harold signed papers with shaking hands, but this time no one rushed him, no one stood over him. When it was over, the sun was setting. Mason knocked lightly on the open door. "You did good, Harold." Harold nodded. Tears ran freely now. "I thought staying quiet was keeping me safe," he said. Mason shook his head. "Silence only protects the wrong people." As the bike started up, Harold stood on the porch. The noise didn't scare him anymore. For the first time in a long time, the house didn't feel like a cage. It felt like home again. That night, sleep didn't come easily. Harold lay in his bed staring at the ceiling fan as it turned slowly, clicking once every rotation. The house was quiet, but not the dangerous quiet he had learned to fear. This was a different kind. A waiting quiet, like the pause after a storm when you're not sure if the clouds are truly gone. Every sound made him flinch. A car passing outside, the refrigerator humming, the floor settling beneath old wood. For months his body had learned to stay alert, to stay small, to listen for footsteps. Even now, with the locks changed and Melissa gone, his muscles refused to relax. He pulled his sleeve back again and studied his wrist. The bruises were darker under the bedroom light. Fingerprints clear as memory. He touched them gently, then stopped. A wave of anger rose, sharp and unfamiliar. Anger hadn't been allowed before. He shuffled to the kitchen and poured a glass of water. His hands shook so badly he spilled some on the counter. No one snapped at him. No one grabbed his arm. The silence stayed kind. On the table sat a business card Mason had left behind, just a name and a number. No club logo, no warning, just call if you need us. Harold sat down and cried. Not loud, not dramatic, just quiet tears slipping down his face as his shoulders sagged forward. He cried for a leaner, for the man he used to be, for the months he lost believing fear was normal. Across town, Mason sat on his bike outside his own house, helmet resting on the handlebars. He stared at nothing for a long time. He'd seen this before, different faces. Same damage. People always thought the bruises were the worst part. They weren't. The worst part was teaching someone they deserved it. Mason finally stood, stretching his stiff knees. He knew the road ahead for Harold wouldn't be easy. Paperwork, questions, doubt, healing that didn't follow a straight line. But Harold had broken the rule, and once silence breaks, it never fully grows back. The days that followed were heavier than Harold expected. People came and went. Social workers, bank representatives, a woman from the county who spoke gently but asked hard questions. Each visit reopened something. Each form forced Harold to admit what he'd lost. $41,000, 6 months of medication mismanagement, countless nights locked in his room. Saying it out loud made it real. Some mornings, Harold woke up convinced he had imagined everything, that maybe Melissa had only been strict, that maybe he had misunderstood. Doubt crept in quietly, like it always does when fear has lived somewhere too long. But then he'd look at his wrist. or remember the way his door clicked shut from the outside. One afternoon, a neighbor knocked, Mrs. Callahan from across the street. She brought a casserole and stood awkwardly on the porch, eyes full of regret. "I thought you wanted privacy," she said softly. "She told us not to bother you." Harold nodded. He didn't blame her. That was the hardest part. Melissa had worn kindness like armor. She'd used concern as a weapon. News traveled fast in a small town. Whispers followed. Some people were sympathetic. Others were skeptical. "You never said anything," someone muttered at the pharmacy. Harold wanted to scream. Instead, he said, "I tried." At the diner, Mason and two others sat with him one morning. No bikes, no vests, just men drinking coffee with an old man who needed company. "You're doing the hardest part now," Mason said, "living after." Harold stared into his mug. "I feel weak." Mason shook his head. "You survived. Weak doesn't do that." That night, Harold called his son, left a voicemail. His voice shook, but he didn't stop. "I need help," he said, "and I'm done being quiet." Melissa Grant's arrest didn't make headlines. No breaking news, no flashing lights, just a short article buried on page 6 of the local paper. Caregiver charged with elder abuse and financial exploitation. But for Harold, it felt like the world shifted. During the hearing, he sat in the front row. Mason was there too, sitting 2 rows behind, arms folded, silent support like a shadow that refused to leave. Melissa didn't look at him. Her lawyer spoke quickly, calmly, suggested confusion, suggested misunderstanding, suggested Harold's age made his memory unreliable. The old doubt tried to return. Then the photos were shown. The bruises, the bank records, the locked door reports, the medication discrepancies. The truth stacked up piece by piece until it was too heavy to deny. When the judge spoke Harold's name, he stood. His legs shook, but he stayed upright. "I stayed quiet because I was afraid," he said. His voice carried farther than he expected. "But being quiet almost destroyed me." The courtroom was still. Outside, reporters asked questions. Harold waved them away. This story wasn't for spectacle, it was for survival. That evening, he returned home and opened Alina's old sewing drawer. Inside, he found a note she'd written years ago, tucked between patterns. "You are stronger than you think." Harold pressed the paper to his chest and let out a breath he felt he'd been holding for months. Across town, Mason watched the sunset from his bike. Another wrong exposed, another silence broken. He knew there would be more. There always were. Spring came slowly that year. Flowers bloomed where Harold hadn't expected them. He started tending the small garden again, one careful movement at a time. His hands still shook, but they remembered what to do. He volunteered at the senior center once a week. Not to talk, just to sit, to listen. Sometimes that was enough. One afternoon, an elderly woman leaned close and whispered, "My aide says I complain." Healing did not arrive all at once. It came in fragments. In moments so small Harold almost missed them, like the first time he slept through the night without waking to check the lock. For the morning he realized he hadn't flinched when someone stood behind him in line at the grocery store, but shadows lingered. Certain sounds still pulled him backward, a sharp tone in someone's voice, a door closing too firmly, a hand gripping his arm for balance. His body reacted before his mind could catch up. One afternoon at the senior center, a volunteer gently guided him toward a chair. Her fingers brushed his wrist. Harold's breath caught. His chest tightened. He pulled away too fast, embarrassment flushing his face. "I'm sorry," he said quickly. The volunteer shook her head. "You don't have to apologize for protecting yourself." That sentence stayed with him. For years he had been taught that protecting himself was wrong, that it was rude, disruptive, dangerous. Melissa had wrapped cruelty in the language of care. Untangling that took time. At home, Harold started leaving lights on at night, not because he needed them, but because he could. Choice felt new, strange, powerful. He attended counseling sessions arranged through the county. The therapist spoke softly, never rushed him. She explained trauma in simple words, how fear trains the body, how silence becomes a habit. "You didn't fail," she told him once. "Your nervous system did exactly what it needed to survive." Harold nodded slowly. Some evenings, Mason called, short conversation, no heavy questions. "You good?" "I'm okay." "That's enough for today." Those calls mattered more than Mason knew. One night, Harold stood in the hallway and looked at the bedroom door. He closed it gently, then opened it again, then left it open. No one stopped him. He sat on the edge of the bed and whispered, "I'm allowed to choose." The words felt awkward, but true. At the support group, Harold met people whose stories ended differently. A man named Leonard who lost his house before anyone noticed. A woman named Ruth whose caregiver disappeared with everything she owned. Some spoke. Some stared at the floor. Some never came back after the first meeting. One chair stayed empty every week. Harold asked about it once. "That was June," the facilitator said quietly. "She passed before the case moved forward." The room fell silent. Harold thought about how close he had come to becoming an empty chair, a name mentioned softly, a story summarized in past tense. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table, Eleanor's mug in front of him, untouched. He imagined June staying quiet, following the rule, waiting for help that never arrived. Anger came back, but this time it didn't scare him, it sharpened him. The next week, Harold stood during the group session. His voice shook, but he didn't sit back down. "I stayed quiet because I thought it was safer," he said, "but quiet almost erased me." People looked up. "If you're scared," he continued, "that doesn't mean you're weak. It means someone taught you fear." Afterward, a man approached him with tears in his eyes. "I thought it was just me," he said. Harold shook his head. "It never is." Word spread, slowly. Harold was asked to speak at a local church, then a community center. He didn't prepare speeches. He just told the truth. Mason attended one talk, standing near the back. He watched Harold speak with trembling hands but steady eyes. When it ended, Mason nodded once. Pride, quiet and heavy. Not everyone gets justice. But sometimes one voice changes the rules. The letter arrived on a Tuesday. Harold recognized the handwriting immediately. His son. He sat with it for nearly an hour before opening it. Fear crept in. Old habits whispered, "What if this goes wrong too?" Finally, he unfolded the paper. "I didn't know," his son wrote, "and I should have. I'm sorry I wasn't there. I'm coming home if you'll let me." Harold cried harder than he had the day Melissa was arrested. When his son arrived, they stood awkwardly in the living room. Years of distance sat between them. Regret filled the air. "I should have asked more questions," his son said. "I thought giving you space was respect." Harold nodded. "I thought staying quiet was love." They laughed softly at that. Sad laughter, healing laughter. That evening they cooked dinner together, burned the garlic, ordered pizza instead. It felt normal and precious. Later, Mason stopped by briefly, didn't stay long, just shook his son's hand. "You raised a brave man," Mason said. Harold corrected him gently. "He helped me remember I already was." As Mason rode away, Harold watched the taillight fade. He knew he might never need help like that again, but knowing it existed mattered. In bed that night, Harold closed his eyes. The silence felt different now, not a threat, a rest. By summer's end, the garden was full again. Tomatoes hung heavy on the vines. Basil filled the air with green sweetness. Harold worked slowly, carefully, but with purpose. Eleanor would have liked that. He placed a small bench near the flowers. Sometimes he sat there and talked out loud. Sometimes he didn't say anything at all. Both were allowed now. Harold began volunteering with an elder advocacy group. He wasn't loud, he wasn't dramatic, he just listened. And when someone whispered, "They tell me to stay quiet," Harold leaned in. "You don't have to," he said every time. The phrase spread, written on pamphlets, said in meetings, passed from one trembling voice to another. Mason heard about it once, second-hand. He smiled to himself. On a cool evening, Harold stood on his porch as motorcycles passed on the highway in the distance. The sound no longer made his heart race. It reminded him of the day he chose to speak, of the men who listened, of the rule he broke. Inside, Eleanor's mug sat on the counter. This time, Harold used it, filled it with tea, held it with steady hands. Somewhere, someone was still being told to stay quiet, but because Harold didn't, fewer people would listen to that lie. And sometimes that's how change begins. It happened when Harold least expected it. He was standing in line at the pharmacy, prescription slip folded neatly in his pocket, when a man behind him sighed loudly. The line was slow. Harold stepped forward carefully, counting the tiles on the floor the way he always did when crowds made him uneasy. "Can you move it along?" The man snapped. "Some of us have places to be." Harold felt the familiar tightening in his chest. For a split second, the old instinct returned. Don't cause trouble. Stay quiet. Make yourself small. The cashier looked uncomfortable. People avoided eye contact. The moment hung there, heavy and sharp. Harold's hands trembled. Then he did something different. He turned around slowly and met the man's eyes. Not angry, not defensive, just steady. "I'm moving as fast as I can," Harold said. His voice shook, but it didn't disappear. "Please don't rush me." The man blinked, clearly not expecting resistance. He muttered something under his breath and looked away. The cashier smiled at Harold, a small thing, but it mattered. When Harold stepped outside, his heart was racing. His legs felt weak. Speaking up hadn't been easy. It still was, but it was possible. That night, Harold wrote the moment down in a small notebook, not because it was dramatic, because it was proof. Proof that silence no longer owned him. He thought about how many times people are told to stay quiet for convenience, for comfort, for someone else's peace. Harold understood now that quiet has its place, but enforced quiet, that's something else. Before bed, he stood in front of the mirror and looked at his reflection. Older, lined, still healing. "I'm allowed to take up space," he said softly. The words didn't echo back at him like lies anymore. They stayed. On a crisp fall morning, Harold drove himself to a small charity ride on the edge of town. He almost didn't go. Crowds still made him nervous. Noise still rattled his bones, but he wanted to see them, not as saviors, not as legends, just as men. The bikes were lined up in the sun, familiar engines, familiar silhouettes. Mason spotted him first. "You made it," Mason said, surprised and pleased. Harold nodded. "I wanted to say thank you properly." But Mason waved it off. "You already did. You're still here." They stood together watching volunteers hand out food and coats. No speeches, no spotlight. Harold looked at the men around him. Some laughed, some stood quietly. None of them looked like heroes, and that was the point. "You know," Harold said, "people are afraid of you." Mason smiled faintly. "People are afraid of a lot of things they don't understand." Harold nodded. "I was afraid too." "But yeah," Mason said, "but you talked anyway." They shook hands before Harold left. A simple gesture, firm, respectful. Driving home, Harold realized something important. Help doesn't always come wrapped in comfort. Sometimes it comes wrapped in leather and noise and strangers who choose to care anyway. At home, Harold placed the charity flyer on his fridge. Next to it, a photo of Alina. Next to that, a handwritten note. "Speak when it matters." The rule that once trapped him had been replaced, and this one set him free. Years later, people would still ask Harold how he found the courage. He never liked the question. Courage made it sound dramatic, like something he had stored away and suddenly used. The truth was simpler. He was tired of being afraid. Harold lived out his days quietly but not silently.